In 1890, in a photography studio in Liverpool, England, a photograph was taken of a young boy, approximately 5 years old. The photograph shows what appears to be a perfectly normal portrait. The boy is dressed in a formal dark suit with a white collar, sitting peacefully in an upholstered chair. His hands rest naturally in his lap. His expression is serene and calm, with just the hint of a slight smile. His eyes are gently closed, as if he's resting, or perhaps shy about looking at the camera. Everything about the image appears completely ordinary for a Victorian-era child portrait. For over 130 years, this photograph existed in Liverpool's historical archives as a simple example of Victorian childhood photography. Nothing remarkable, nothing unusual, just a well-dressed boy having his portrait taken in a professional studio. But in 2024, when this photograph was submitted for high-resolution digital restoration as part of a project to preserve Liverpool's Victorian records, specialists discovered something in the enhanced image that transformed this seemingly innocent portrait into something profoundly disturbing. The restoration revealed details that had been invisible for over a century. Details hidden in shadows, in reflections, in subtle aspects of the image that only modern technology could recover. What appeared to be a sleeping or resting child was actually something else entirely, and the truth about this photograph had been hiding in plain sight for 134 years. Subscribe now, because this photograph tells a story that will completely change how you see Victorian portraits, and reveals a practice that seems shocking today but was heartbreakingly common in the 1890s. The photograph arrived at Liverpool Central Library's Special Collections in February 2024 as part of a donation from the estate of Margaret Winters, whose family had lived in Liverpool for generations. Among dozens of Victorian photographs, family groups, wedding portraits, studio images, this particular photograph seemed entirely unremarkable, which is exactly why archivist David Chen almost passed over it without special notice. The image showed a young boy, appearing to be approximately 5 years old, photographed in what was clearly a professional photography studio. The quality of the photograph was good for 1890, clear, well-composed, properly exposed with good tonal range. The boy appeared healthy and well cared for. He had light-colored hair, neatly combed and styled in the fashion of the era. His face was round and childlike, with soft features suggesting he was well-nourished, not the gaunt, malnourished appearance common in photographs of working-class Victorian children. He wore formal clothing that indicated his family had means: a dark suit jacket with matching trousers, a crisp white shirt with a high starched collar, and what appeared to be a small bow tie. The clothing looked new and well-fitted, not the handed-down or threadbare garments that poor children typically wore. His shoes, visible at the bottom of the frame, were polished leather, again, a sign of middle-class status or above. The boy was seated in an upholstered chair with carved wooden arms and decorative details. The chair appeared to be studio furniture, positioned against a painted backdrop showing a garden scene with flowers and foliage, standard for Victorian portrait photography studios. His posture was natural and relaxed. He sat back comfortably in the chair, his small hands resting in his lap, one hand loosely over the other. His legs were positioned naturally, feet flat on the floor. His head was tilted very slightly to one side, resting against the chair back in a comfortable, restful position. Most notably, his eyes were closed. His expression appeared peaceful and serene, with just the slightest upward curve to his lips. Not quite a smile, but a pleasant, content look. The closed eyes gave him the appearance of a child who had fallen asleep while sitting for the portrait, or perhaps a shy child who didn't want to look directly at the camera. Everything about the image suggested a typical, if somewhat formal, Victorian child portrait. The only slightly unusual aspect was the closed eyes. Most Victorian portraits showed subjects with eyes open, looking at the camera. But closed eyes weren't unheard of, especially for children who might be shy, tired, or simply unable to hold still for the long exposure times required by 1890s photography. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, Master Henry Thornton, age 5, Liverpool, June 1890. David Chen made his standard cataloging notes. Victorian child portrait, male subject approximately 5 years old, good quality studio photograph. Subject identified as Henry Thornton, Liverpool, dated June 1890. Well-dressed child suggesting middle-class family. Notable for closed eyes, giving peaceful, restful appearance. Good condition for age, some minor fading. Recommend for digitization. Standard example of Victorian portrait photography. The photograph was scheduled for routine high-resolution scanning along with hundreds of others. There was nothing about it that suggested it needed special attention or raised any concerns. It appeared to be exactly what it seemed. A well-off Victorian child having his portrait taken in a professional studio, captured in a moment of peaceful rest. David submitted the photograph to the digital restoration team with a note. Standard Victorian child portrait. Subject appears to be resting or sleeping during photograph. Pleasant image. Good candidate for digital archive. He had no idea that this pleasant image was actually something much darker, and that the boy's restful appearance had a tragic explanation that would only become clear when modern technology revealed what the Victorian photographer had carefully hidden. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the digital restoration specialist, began her work on the Henry Thornton photograph as part of her routine processing of Victorian images. As she started enhancing the photograph, recovering details that had faded over 134 years, she began to notice things that made her pause and look more carefully. The first thing that caught her attention was the boy's skin tone. As she adjusted the tonal values and recovered the original contrast of the photograph, Henry's skin appeared unusually pale, paler than she would expect even accounting for the black and white photography and Victorian indoor complexions. When she enhanced the facial details, his skin had an almost translucent quality, particularly around the eyes and mouth. Might be overexposed in the original, Dr. Mitchell noted to herself. Victorian photographers sometimes struggled with proper exposure, especially when photographing children in indoor studios with limited natural light. She then focused on the boy's hands, resting in his lap. As the image became clearer, something about the hands seemed odd. They were positioned very carefully, very precisely. One hand laid perfectly over the other. But there was something about the positioning that looked arranged rather than natural. The fingers showed no tension, no natural curve, just a completely flat, lifeless positioning. Could be posed very carefully by the photographer, she thought. Victorian photographers did use elaborate poses and positioning to create formal, aesthetically pleasing images. Dr. Mitchell then examined the boy's posture more carefully. He was sitting back in the chair, but as she enhanced the image, his position seemed less like natural rest and more like he had been very deliberately positioned and then remained in exactly that position without any movement whatsoever. Victorian portrait photography required absolute stillness due to long exposure times, but even so there was usually some slight indication of muscle tension or living presence. Henry showed none. His head, tilted slightly against the chair back, appeared to be resting with complete relaxation, perhaps too complete. There was no visible tension in the neck muscles, no subtle signs of a head being actively held in position. The head appeared to simply be settled against the chair with no active support. Most troubling were the closed eyes. As Dr. Mitchell enhanced the facial details, the closed eyelids appeared wrong somehow. They were closed very smoothly, very completely, with no flutter or movement, no slight irregularity. They had an almost artificial smoothness, as if they had been manually positioned rather than naturally closed. She zoomed in further on the eyes. When she enhanced the detail around the eyelids at maximum magnification, she could see very faint indications that suggested the eyelids might have been held in position. Tiny marks or pressure points at the corners of the eyes that could indicate some kind of external force keeping them closed during the photograph. Probably just artifact from the aging, Dr. Mitchell told herself, though she felt increasingly uncertain. She then turned her attention to the overall composition of the photograph. Victorian portrait photographers used various tricks to help subjects remain still during long exposures. Headrests, back supports, even hidden braces that would hold a person in position. Dr. Mitchell examined the area around and behind Henry carefully. The chair he was sitting in was positioned against the painted backdrop, making it difficult to see what might be behind him. But as she enhanced the shadows and darker areas of the image, recovering details that had become nearly black with age, shapes began to emerge. Behind the chair, there appeared to be something, some kind of structure or equipment that was partially visible despite the photographer's attempts to hide it. The shape looked like it could be some kind of frame or stand, positioned directly behind the boy. Support stand for long exposure, Dr. Mitchell noted, common in Victorian photography. But something about it seemed off. The positioning appeared to be very specifically placed, very close to the boy's body, as if it wasn't just helping him stay still, but actually holding him in position. Dr. Mitchell sat back from her monitor, feeling vaguely troubled. Individually, each odd detail could be explained by normal Victorian photography practices or by artifacts of aging. But together, they created a pattern that made her uncomfortable. She decided to examine one more element, the background and any other details that might have been hidden by fading or shadow. As she began enhancing the darkest areas of the image, what she found made her immediately call her supervisor. "I think you need to see this photograph," she said. "I think there's something very wrong with it, and I think we need to research who this child actually was and why this photograph was taken." Dr. Mitchell's supervisor, Dr. James Whitmore, joined her to examine the enhanced images. Together, they began investigating the photograph's provenance and the identity of Master Henry Thornton, age 5, Liverpool, June 1890. Their first step was to search Liverpool historical records for any mention of Henry Thornton. Using census records, parish registers, birth certificates, and death records, they began piecing together the story of the Thornton family. The records revealed that the Thornton family lived in the Everton area of Liverpool, a respectable middle-class neighborhood. The father, William Thornton, was a shipping clerk working for one of Liverpool's major import/export companies, a solid middle-class profession that would have provided comfortable living, but not wealth. The mother, Catherine Thornton, was listed in census records as keeping house. Birth records showed that Henry William Thornton was born on March 15, 1885, which would indeed make him 5 years old in June 1890. He was the youngest of 3 children. He had 2 older sisters, Elizabeth, age 9, and Margaret, age 7, at the time of the photograph. So the family existed, the boy existed. Everything checks out historically, Dr. Whitmore noted. The photograph's caption appears to be accurate. They then searched for any other records related to Henry Thornton, school enrollment, medical records, church attendance, anything that might explain why this particular photograph was taken in June 1890. What they found next made both researchers stop and exchange significant looks. Death records from Liverpool in 1890 showed an entry. Henry William Thornton, Age 5 years, 3 months. Date of death, June 7, 1890. Cause, whooping cough. Address, Everton, Liverpool. The photograph is dated June 1890, Dr. Mitchell said quietly. He died June 7, 1890. They searched photographers' records and studio directories for Liverpool in 1890. They found a photographer named Albert Harrison, portrait and memorial photography, who operated a studio on Bold Street in Liverpool city centre. Harrison's business advertisements in Liverpool newspapers from the era specifically mentioned memorial portraiture and sympathetic photography of deceased loved ones among his services. Parish burial records showed that Henry Thornton was buried on June 9, 1890, at Everton Cemetery, 2 days after his death. The timing was significant. Victorian memorial photographs were typically taken within 24 to 48 hours of death, before decomposition made it difficult to achieve a lifelike appearance. Further research into Victorian photography practices in Liverpool revealed that memorial or post-mortem photography was extremely common in the 1890s, especially for children. Many families, particularly those who had never been able to afford a portrait photograph while their child was alive, would invest in one final memorial photograph as their only permanent image of their lost child. The researchers found contemporary accounts and guides for Victorian photographers on how to photograph the deceased. These guides recommended various techniques, positioning the deceased to look as natural and lifelike as possible, using supports and stands to hold the body in natural-looking positions. In cases of children, sometimes posing them as if sleeping or resting. Various techniques for dealing with eyes, either leaving them closed as if sleeping, or in some cases using glass eyes or propping natural eyes open. Most significantly, they found references to a particular practice for photographing deceased children. Photographers would often pose them to look as if they were simply sleeping or resting, rather than obviously dead. This was meant to be less distressing for the grieving families and to create a memorial image that showed the child in peaceful rest rather than in death. Henry Thornton died on June 7, 1890, Dr. Whitmore said. This photograph was almost certainly taken on June 8th or June 9th, either the day after his death or the day of his burial. Everything about this image, the closed eyes, the resting pose, the peaceful expression, was deliberately created by the photographer to make a dead child look as if he was simply sleeping. The question is, Dr. Mitchell added, what details did the photographer try to hide that our restoration is now revealing? They returned to the enhanced digital images with new understanding, examining every detail with the knowledge that this was not a portrait of a living, sleeping child, but a carefully staged memorial photograph of a dead one. With the knowledge that this was a post-mortem photograph, Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Whitmore re-examined every enhanced detail with new understanding. What they found confirmed that this image showed a deceased child posed to look as lifelike as possible. The support structure behind the chair became clearly visible in the enhanced image. It was a specialized posing stand, a metal frame with adjustable clamps and supports that Victorian photographers used to hold deceased subjects in upright positions. The stand had multiple points of contact, supports at the back, at the neck, hidden by the chair's high back, and possibly at the sides. Without this support, Henry's body could not have maintained the seated position. There was no muscle tension, no core strength, no living ability to sit upright. The stand was literally holding his body in the chair, maintaining the peaceful, resting pose that the photographer had created. The boy's hands, so carefully positioned in his lap, showed clear evidence of post-mortem arrangement when examined at high magnification. The fingers were positioned in a specific, deliberate pattern, but there was absolutely no muscle tone, no natural tension. The hands had been carefully placed one over the other and remained exactly as positioned. They had never moved, never relaxed, never shifted even slightly during the long exposure. Most revealing were the enhanced details of Henry's face. His skin tone, when properly analyzed, showed the distinctive pallor of death, not just pale but with a grayish-blue undertone, particularly visible around the lips and under the eyes. Victorian photographers sometimes applied makeup to deceased subjects to add color, but this photograph appeared to show Henry without such enhancement. His natural post-mortem complexion visible. The closed eyelids, when examined at extreme magnification, showed clear evidence of having been manually positioned. There were subtle indications, tiny pressure marks, slight irregularities in the skin around the eyes, that suggested the eyelids had been carefully closed and possibly secured in place during the photograph. Victorian photographers had various methods for keeping eyelids closed, sometimes using special adhesive, sometimes using tiny weights, sometimes simply pressing them closed and photographing quickly before they naturally opened slightly. The enhancement also revealed something more subtle but deeply poignant. When Dr. Mitchell adjusted the color channels and tonal values in specific ways, she could see the very faint trace of post-mortem lividity, the pooling of blood that occurs after death. In Henry's case, there was slight discoloration visible along his right side, the side where he had apparently been lying before being posed for the photograph. Perhaps most heartbreaking was a detail that became visible in the deepest shadows of the image, in the darkest area behind the chair where the painted backdrop didn't quite reach. When this area was enhanced to maximum visibility, recovering details that were nearly black in the original, a shape emerged. What appeared to be a small coffin, positioned just out of frame, waiting. The photographer had positioned the coffin nearby, ready to receive Henry's body immediately after the photograph was completed. The family would have had only a brief window for the photograph before burial, and the coffin was kept close by as a grim reminder of the photograph's true purpose and the time pressure involved. Further enhancement of the background revealed two more figures that had been almost completely lost to shadow and fading. Standing far in the background, nearly invisible in the original photograph, but recoverable through digital enhancement, were two adults, almost certainly Henry's parents, William and Catherine Thornton, standing in the darkest part of the studio watching as their dead son was photographed. Their faces, though heavily shadowed and indistinct even in the enhanced image, appeared to show expressions of profound grief. The mother's hand was raised to her face, covering her mouth or wiping tears. The father stood rigidly, one hand on his wife's shoulder, his posture suggesting someone barely maintaining composure. They had positioned themselves in the shadows, outside the main photograph, so that the image would show only Henry. The memorial would be of him alone, peaceful and at rest, without the intrusion of their grief into the frame. The photograph that had seemed to show a sleeping or resting child revealed itself as an elaborate construction. A deceased child held in position by hidden supports, carefully posed and positioned to create the illusion of peaceful rest, photographed quickly while his parents watched from the shadows, with his coffin waiting just out of frame. It was a performance of normalcy, a desperate attempt to preserve one final image of Henry that showed him looking as he had in life, not dead, but simply at peace, simply resting, simply their little boy one last time. With the photograph's true nature finally understood, the researchers delved deeper into the Thornton family story, seeking to understand the full context of why this memorial photograph was taken and what it meant to the family who commissioned it. Whooping cough, the disease that killed Henry Thornton, was one of the most feared childhood illnesses in Victorian England. The bacterial infection caused severe coughing fits so intense the children would gasp for air with a characteristic whooping sound. The disease was particularly deadly for children under 5, with mortality rates of 20 to 30% for infected children in that age group. Before vaccines, the whooping cough vaccine wasn't developed until the 1940s. Whooping cough killed thousands of British children every year. The disease typically lasted 6 to 10 weeks, with children suffering through increasingly severe coughing fits that could cause vomiting, broken ribs, hemorrhaging, and eventually death from exhaustion or pneumonia. Medical records from Liverpool in June 1890 showed a whooping cough outbreak in the Everton area. Parish records indicated that 3 other children died of whooping cough in the same neighborhood within the same 2-week period. For the Thornton family, Henry's death would have been devastating, but not surprising. They would have known other families who had lost children to the disease. What was more unusual was their decision to commission a memorial photograph. Research into photographer Albert Harrison's business records, partially preserved in Liverpool archives, showed that the Thornton family paid 15 shillings for Henry's memorial portrait, a very significant sum for a middle-class family in 1890, roughly equivalent to 3 days' wages for a shipping clerk like William Thornton. The expense was justified by the fact that the Thorntons had never been able to afford a photograph of Henry while he was alive. Photography in 1890 was still expensive enough that working and middle-class families typically couldn't afford casual portraits. Many families went their entire lives without being photographed. For the Thorntons, this memorial photograph would be the only image they would ever have of their youngest child. Harrison's records included a note about the Thornton Commission. Memorial portrait, young male child, age 5. Special request. Pose as sleeping, eyes closed, peaceful appearance. Family specifically requested natural, restful positioning. Extended session to achieve desired effect. The extended session notation was significant. Creating a memorial photograph that looked natural and peaceful, rather than obviously post-mortem, required considerable time and skill. The photographer had to position Henry's body carefully, arrange his clothing, close and secure his eyelids, position his hands naturally, adjust the support stand to hold him properly while keeping it hidden, arrange the lighting to minimize the appearance of death, and then execute the long exposure photograph while the body remained in exactly the right position. All of this was done while the grieving parents waited, watching their dead child being posed and adjusted like a doll, enduring the horrible reality of his death, while simultaneously trying to create one final image that would show him as they wanted to remember him. Census records showed that the Thornton family remained in Liverpool for many years after Henry's death. William Thornton continued working as a shipping clerk until his retirement in 1918. Catherine Thornton lived until 1932. Their 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, both survived to adulthood, married, and had children of their own. A remarkable discovery came from the records of Margaret Thornton, later Margaret Davies, Henry's older sister, who was 7 years old when he died. In 1951, at age 68, Margaret was interviewed as part of an oral history project documenting Victorian Liverpool. In the interview, she briefly mentioned her brother. "I had a little brother who died when I was 7, Henry. He got the whooping cough and he died. I remember they took him to have his photograph made after he died, and they told us he looked like he was sleeping. My mother kept that photograph in a frame on the mantelpiece for the rest of her life. She would talk to it sometimes when she thought no one was listening, tell him about what we were doing, tell him she missed him. That photograph was the only picture we ever had of Henry. My mother said at least she had something to look at, something to show that he had been real, that he had been ours." The photograph remained in the Thornton family for over a century, passing from Catherine to her daughters, then to their children and grandchildren, until it was finally donated to the Liverpool archives by Margaret Winters, Henry's great-great-niece, who included it in her family's document donation without realizing its true nature. The photograph of Henry Thornton, properly understood, becomes something more than just a Victorian curiosity or an example of a now obsolete practice. It becomes a document of parental love and grief, a desperate attempt to hold on to what had been lost, and a reminder of how differently death was experienced in an era when losing a child was tragically common. Victorian memorial photography seems shocking to modern viewers because we are fortunate enough to live in an era where child mortality is rare, where we can take unlimited photographs of our loved ones at no cost, where death is sanitized and removed from daily experience. We have the luxury of finding these Victorian practices strange and macabre. But for the Thornton family in 1890, this photograph was an act of love. They paid a significant sum, money they could barely afford, to have one image of their son. They endured the horror of watching his body be posed and photographed because they desperately wanted something to remember him by. They wanted proof that he had existed, that he had been theirs, that he had been loved. The photograph that seemed to show a sleeping child actually showed parents' love trying to preserve their son's memory in the only way available to them. The closed eyes that looked peaceful were closed by a photographer's careful hands. The resting pose that looked natural was maintained by hidden supports. The serene expression was an illusion created through careful positioning and lighting. But the love behind the photograph was real. The grief that motivated it was real. The parents standing in the shadows, watching, were real. The mother who would talk to this photograph for the next 4 decades was real. The sister who remembered her brother and kept his photograph for 61 years after her mother's death was real. Henry Thornton died at age 5 on June 7, 1890. But in the photograph, he remains forever 5 years old, forever at rest, forever preserved in the way his family wanted to remember him. Not dead, but sleeping, not lost, but peaceful, not gone, but simply resting. The photograph isn't about death. It's about love that refused to let go completely, about memory preserved through the only means available, about a family's desperate need to have something, anything, to show that their little boy had existed and had been theirs. When we look at this photograph now, knowing what it really shows, we're not seeing Victorian morbidity or strange customs. We're seeing the same grief and love that parents feel today when they lose a child. We're seeing the universal human need to preserve memory, to hold on to the beloved, to make permanent what is frighteningly temporary. The photograph that seemed normal at first glance turned out to be anything but normal. Yet in another sense, it showed something entirely normal. The timeless, universal experience of losing someone you love and wanting desperately to preserve some piece of them, some memory, some proof that they were real and were loved. Henry Thornton's photograph, hidden in archives for over 130 years, finally reveals its truth. Not just the technical truth of how it was created, but the emotional truth of why it was created. And in that truth, there is something heartbreaking and beautiful and profoundly human.